I think my presentation links closely to every single presenter, and I'm just happy here, the voice of female representation today, sharing my uncertainties and turning them into hopes for the future. So I think more so than ever, the pandemic has really amplified further the growing belief that there's definitely something wrong with our current assessment systems. We need a system that supports our children, especially our disadvantaged children, just to demonstrate on a more level playing field what they know and what strengths and qualities they have by looking at what knowledge, skills, attitudes and values they have to bring. And will today's children what they need to thrive and shape the world? And how can primary schools develop these further? And what I want to base my next slide on is really what's in place at the moment to judge the effectiveness of primary schools. So we've got the introduction of this new baseline, and my main criticisms are that I personally feel it's unnecessary, inaccurate. I think it's unfair on children, but it's another way of placing schools under pressure. So aggregating scores in proposed 20-minute test environments to produce a single number is really, it's misguided and inherently unreliable. The Association for Professional Development in Early Years wrote that there's no evidence to actually show, but there's much doubt, that the data produced from the baseline assessment can be of any use when judging schools' performance 7 years later when children are in year 6. So the relationship between the data produced in the baseline and in comparison to the data at Key Stage 2 is seen as incomparable and making the process measures completely meaningless. Phonics screening. Well, there's little evidence to show that phonics screening does actually boost literacy skills. And I don't know if you're familiar with the works of Geoffrey Bowers from the University of Bristol, but he said that despite the widespread consensus in the research community that this reading method is the preferable one as opposed to meaning-based approaches, there's actually a lack of empirical evidence to suggest that it leads to better outcomes. Well, last year we all heard the Minister, Nick Gibb, declare victory on the phonics war by saying, you know, the debate's over, it's the best way to teach reading. But this new analysis that we have now, by points of evidence, is really directly contradicting what Mr. Gibbs says. And if we look at the data from phonics screening, compare that to the reading assessments at the end of Key Stage 2, I think the data also contradicts this. And then, of course, there's the new tables checks, great for year 4, you know, another tool that will be hit on the head with, because it's not supposed to be deployed as a diagnostic tool for schools. And yet we know the DfE will not only be reporting our data nationally, it will also be reported locally. And this data, of course, is available to Ofsted. So let me go now on to SATs. So I believe SATs were introduced to enable schools to understand how well they were doing in comparison to schools performing nationally. But what it's actually done is it sets standards completely out of context, disadvantaging our disadvantaged even further. SATs tests only test a small range of our children's ability. It doesn't teach about problem solving, about creativity, about all the lists mentioned today in Bill's presentations and echoed again in Andy's. But what I think it does do is the league tables that are produced and the Ofsted inspections that then mark the effectiveness of the schools is actually destroying the reputation, and the tests do narrow our curriculums. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against testing. It's what we're testing and how we test children, and also how we publish that data that concerns me. And I think it was Bill that quoted, or it could have been Andy, that 1/3 of our youngsters fail at GCSE. Well, I can add that 45% of that third are youngsters from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I think the factors that are most challenging to disadvantaged backgrounds are factors such as attendance, multiple occupancy, children living in rented homes or learning authority accommodation, there's mobility, they have less access to IT. And I think all this means that pupils are less likely to keep up with learning. I've also got an issue with the way papers are written and the way papers are assessed. the language that tests use are there to almost trip up our pupils that don't have the fluency, the English fluency. Children from middle classes often outperform our disadvantaged pupils. And then there's the stress of the test. Social, emotional challenges escalate, and that's even more of an injustice. The stress associated with tests is experiencing disproportionately by our disadvantaged learners, who are then put at an even greater risk of failing with the injustice that the high stakes testing poses. And I think during lockdown, this has been intensified further, where services such as social care, mental health, or even counsellors has diminished. Unconscious bias has been linked to teacher assessment and also linked to disadvantaged pupils and BAME pupils. But I actually think that the tests, the actual test sets for our children are biased. The myriad of cultural references means that disadvantaged pupils from families with less cultural capital are further disadvantaged. So I think there's a need for new solutions. I think the world is rapidly changing, and there's a need for a broad set of knowledge, skills, attitudes and values in action to take their place, because our children are more than a grade. And I've said before, primary school teachers, primary school leaders are not opposed to testing. We have high standards and expectations, and we're not taking away the academic side. I think it's time to complement that now. I think it's time to look at other schools in the UK. I think it's time to look at the world and see what's happening, because learning's not just about achievement, it's about dignity too. I think that previously, we'd go to school, create young people who'd sit exams and hopefully get a job, and often saying that same job for life. But this is such an outdated view. I think it's time to learn from other assessment practices. I think it's time to rethink assessment, to look at the written, the verbal, the visual, to look at character strengths, what pedagogies are out there for deeper learning, to look at real world learning and well-being, and to ask ourselves that question: are we actually preparing our children for this, and how are we preparing them? Because I think an element of what, and I think it was Andy that said, the fear of criticism connected to failure can sometimes outweigh decisions that are made. But I think the pandemic has now eradicated that, and we need to look at how we're preparing children for the future that's going to be theirs. So I think I go back to these four little people and ask again, how are we assessing our children's knowledge, their skills, their attitudes and their values? And that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Amazing, Christalla. Thank you so much. Your voice is so powerful within this. And absolutely that question, are we preparing our children for the future? What are we assessing? And absolutely right. Assessment is broken. We know that. And we all need to come together and keep this debate going and keep this momentum going to make sure we make a change for the future of our children.
And I think it's for every child, and making sure every child's abilities are assessed, because at the moment, or when we're talking about assessment, if we're looking at progress, I think the biases that exist, are then reflected later on as those children transition into secondary and then further ed. And I think it's time that we look at that with open eyes and really debate on everything that's been mentioned today. So thank you for the opportunity today, Flora.